It was a quiet Saturday afternoon, and I found myself in the kitchen of my girlfriend's family home, absent-mindedly stirring a pot of soup. The place was cozy, the kind of kitchen that exuded warmth and familiarity, with its rustic wooden cabinets and sunlight filtering through the small window above the sink. My girlfriend, Anna, had run out to grab a few things from the store, leaving me alone to prep for the family dinner later that night. As I moved around the kitchen, humming quietly to myself, I didn't hear the soft footsteps behind me until it was too late. Her mother, Clara, entered the kitchen quietly, startling me when she appeared beside me. "Oh, I didn't mean to sneak up on you," Clara said, her voice carrying a warm laugh. "You're such a focused cook." I chuckled, my nerves jumping a little at her sudden presence. Clara was always so composed, so effortlessly graceful in everything she did. At 51, she still carried herself with a youthful energy. Her eyes sparkled with the same mischievous glint that I saw in Anna, and though I knew I should have been used to it by now, her presence always made me feel a little off balance. "I guess I got a little lost in the soup," I replied, trying to ease the unexpected tension that had slipped into the room. "Anna should be back soon." Clara leaned against the counter beside me, her gaze sweeping over the kitchen before landing on me. She gave me a small, knowing smile, and for a brief moment, it felt like the air between us shifted, like an unspoken energy lingered just beneath the surface. "Well, you've been a great help already," she said, her tone casual, but there was something else in the way she spoke, something I couldn't quite place. "Anna's lucky to have you around." Her compliment caught me off guard, and I felt a warm flush rise to my cheeks. I turned my attention back to the soup, stirring it more vigorously than necessary. "Thanks, Clara," I said. "I just want to make sure everything's ready for tonight." She stepped closer, her hand brushing lightly against mine as she reached for the ladle to taste the soup. The touch was subtle, almost accidental, but it sent a strange, electric jolt through me, one I didn't expect. I looked up at her, confused by my own reaction. Clara smiled softly, her eyes lingering on me for a moment too long before she turned her attention to the soup. "It's perfect," she said, her voice dropping to a lower, more intimate tone. "You're doing great." The tension in the air became palpable, and I found myself hyper-aware of how close she was standing. I hadn't realized how much space she had closed between us, and I suddenly felt the weight of her presence in a way that was impossible to ignore. "I should check on the bread," I mumbled, trying to break the moment, but my voice came out shaky, betraying the discomfort stirring inside me. Clara didn't move immediately. Instead, she lingered a second longer, her eyes studying me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. "Take your time," she finally said, stepping back just enough to give me some room, though the tension between us still hung thick in the air. I busied myself with the bread, trying to shake off the strange energy that had settled over the kitchen. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about that brief touch, the way her gaze had lingered on me, how something about it felt different. And then I heard her footsteps again, closer this time. She stood directly behind me, and before I could react, I felt the warmth of her breath on my neck as she leaned in. "You know," Clara whispered, her voice barely above a murmur, "you've always been so kind to Anna, to all of us. I've noticed." Her words sent a wave of confusion crashing through me, and I stood frozen in place, my hands gripping the edge of the counter. "Clara," I started, but I didn't know how to finish the sentence. What was happening? What was this feeling? She didn't pull away. Instead, her hand rested gently on my shoulder, the warmth of her touch seeping through the fabric of my shirt. I could feel my pulse quickening, my heart hammering in my chest. "I'm sorry," she said softly, and yet, she didn't move. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." The truth was, I didn't know what I was feeling. My mind was racing, torn between the boundaries that had always been there and the strange, new tension that was clouding my thoughts. I swallowed hard, trying to find my voice. "It's okay," I whispered, though I wasn't entirely sure it was. Clara's hand lingered on my shoulder for a moment longer before she finally stepped back, giving me the space I so desperately needed. The air in the kitchen felt thick, heavy with the weight of what had just passed between us. I turned slowly to face her, my eyes searching hers for some kind of explanation, but all I found was that same soft smile, the one that made my stomach flip in ways I didn't want to acknowledge. "I'll leave you to finish up," she said, her voice light again, as if nothing had happened. But as she walked away, I could feel the tension still thrumming through the room, the unspoken energy that had been there from the moment she entered. And when the door closed behind her, I let out a shaky breath, realizing that whatever had just happened wasn't over. The kitchen felt different after Clara left, as though the very air had changed, thick with a strange, lingering electricity. My hands were shaking slightly, and I had to place the ladle down before I spilled the soup everywhere. The moment between us played on a loop in my head, her soft touch on my shoulder, the way her voice dropped to that intimate whisper, how close she had been. I couldn't shake it, couldn't stop myself from replaying it over and over. What was I supposed to do? This was Anna's mother, the woman I had spent countless dinners with, the woman who had always been warm and kind, but never like that. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. Had I misinterpreted things? Was it all in my head? I tried to focus on finishing up dinner preparations, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Clara. Every time I thought I had shaken it off, the memory of her touch came rushing back, making my skin tingle in a way I didn't want to admit. I was startled by my own reaction, by how much it affected me. By the time Anna came home, I had managed to calm myself down, or at least I thought I had. But the second she stepped into the kitchen, smiling and carefree, I felt the weight of guilt pressing down on me. Nothing had happened, not really, but it felt like I was carrying a secret. "Everything smells amazing," Anna exclaimed as she walked in, placing the grocery bags on the counter. She kissed me on the cheek, her bright eyes scanning the kitchen. "Looks like you've got everything under control." I forced a smile, trying to push the awkwardness out of my mind. "Yeah, just finishing up the last touches." Anna busied herself unpacking the bags, talking excitedly about the plans for the evening. Her mom and dad would be joining us, along with her younger brother, Liam. A family dinner, just like so many we had before. But now, everything felt different, tainted by that moment with Clara. As Anna continued chatting, I couldn't help but glance at the kitchen doorway, half expecting Clara to walk back in. My pulse quickened at the thought, and I immediately chastised myself. What was wrong with me? Why couldn't I just let it go? The dinner itself was a blur. The entire family gathered around the table, laughter and conversation flowing easily. Anna's father, Robert, was his usual jovial self, telling stories from work while Liam chimed in with his latest adventures from university. Anna sat beside me, her hand occasionally resting on my knee in a familiar, comfortable gesture. And across from me, Clara. She was her usual graceful self, smiling and laughing along with the rest of the family. But every time her eyes met mine, I felt that same jolt of tension. Her smile was knowing, her gaze lingering just a fraction too long. I kept my responses short, trying to avoid her gaze, but it was impossible not to feel the pull of whatever had started earlier in the kitchen. At one point, during a lull in the conversation, I excused myself to grab something from the kitchen. I needed air, needed to get away from the table, if only for a moment. As I stood at the counter, taking a deep breath, I heard footsteps behind me. My heart skipped a beat. "Are you okay?" It was Clara's voice, soft and concerned. She stood just a few feet behind me, her expression unreadable. I nodded quickly, trying to mask the anxiety bubbling up inside me. "Yeah, just needed a breather," I said, forcing a chuckle that sounded more nervous than I intended. Clara didn't move, her eyes studying me in that same way she had earlier. "You've been quiet tonight," she remarked, her tone casual, but there was something beneath it. "Everything all right?" I swallowed hard, nodding again. "Yeah, everything's fine. Just a lot on my mind." She stepped closer, her presence commanding my attention, even though I desperately wanted to escape. "If something's bothering you, you can always talk to me," she said, her voice soft, almost coaxing. I turned to face her, my heart racing, and for a moment, I was at a loss for words. I didn't know how to respond. didn't know how to navigate the tension that was growing between us. She was so close now, and I could feel the warmth radiating off her skin, could smell the faint perfume she wore, a scent that had once seemed so harmless, but now felt overwhelming. "I'm fine," I managed to say, though my voice was shaky. Clara didn't break eye contact, her gaze intense. She opened her mouth to say something else, but at that exact moment, Anna walked into the kitchen. "Hey, what's taking so long?" she asked with a laugh, breaking the spell that had settled over the room. I stepped back, quickly turning toward the counter, pretending to be busy with something. Clara smiled warmly at Anna, as if nothing had happened, and reached for a bottle of wine. "Just giving him a little help in here," she said casually, her tone so light that it was almost impossible to believe that anything had passed between us at all. But as she brushed past me to grab a glass, her hand grazed mine, another subtle, fleeting touch that sent a shiver down my spine. I glanced at her, but she didn't look back. Instead, she walked back to the dining room, leaving me standing there with my heart pounding in my chest. Anna hadn't noticed anything, but I could feel the tension tightening around me like a noose. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that whatever had started between Clara and me wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As the evening wore on, I tried to push everything that had happened into the background. Dinner resumed, filled with light-hearted banter and laughter, but my thoughts were elsewhere. Every time I caught a glimpse of Clara across the table, my mind swirled with confusion and guilt. Her behavior had been so subtle that I almost questioned whether I had imagined the entire thing. But then I would remember the soft brush of her hand against mine, the warmth in her gaze, and the weight of her presence standing just inches away from me in the kitchen. I couldn't deny what I had felt. After dessert, I volunteered to help clear the table. I needed a distraction, anything to keep my mind occupied and away from the swirl of emotions that had built up over the course of the evening. Anna's father and brother retreated to the living room to watch some game, and Anna followed them after giving me a kiss on the cheek. Clara stayed behind in the dining room, stacking plates with her usual grace. I could feel her eyes on me, even though I pretended not to notice. My hands moved automatically, picking up glasses and silverware, but my heart was pounding in my chest. As I turned to carry a stack of dishes into the kitchen, Clara caught my arm gently. The touch was soft but deliberate, and it stopped me in my tracks. I turned to face her, my pulse quickening. She looked up at me, her expression calm, but there was a quiet intensity behind her eyes. "Let me help you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. There was no one else in the room, no one to interrupt this time. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words settle over me like a heavy blanket. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, none of which made any sense. "Clara," I began, but she shook her head, silencing me with a look. "It's okay," she said softly, stepping closer to me. Her fingers lingered on my arm for just a second longer before she released me, reaching for the stack of plates in my hands. "I just want to talk." Her words should have been reassuring, but they only made the knot in my stomach tighten. I followed her into the kitchen, setting the plates down on the counter as she moved beside me, her presence once again too close for comfort. For a few moments, we worked in silence, rinsing dishes and loading the dishwasher, the tension in the air palpable. I could feel her eyes on me, and I knew that something was coming, something I wasn't prepared to face. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Clara spoke. "I know this is strange," she said quietly, her hands pausing over the sink. "And I don't want you to feel uncomfortable." I didn't know how to respond. My throat felt tight, and the words caught in my chest. I turned to look at her, and the vulnerability in her expression caught me off guard. She wasn't playing games, wasn't trying to toy with me. There was something genuine in her eyes, something that made me feel both uneasy and drawn to her. She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the counter. "There's something between us, isn't there?" Her question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears, my mind spinning. There was no denying it now. The tension, the looks, the touches, they hadn't been imagined. They were real, and she felt them too. I swallowed hard, my voice shaky. Clara, I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to navigate the minefield we had stumbled into. She took a step closer, her hand reaching out to brush lightly against mine. The touch was soft, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me. My breath hitched, and I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to think. I know it's wrong, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. But I can't help how I feel. Her confession left me reeling. This was Anna's mother, the woman I had grown to admire and respect, and yet here we were, standing in her kitchen, tiptoeing around an unspoken attraction that neither of us should have allowed to exist. I wanted to back away, to walk out of the room and pretend that nothing had happened, but my feet stayed rooted to the floor. Clara's eyes searched mine, and I could see the same confusion, the same conflict, mirrored back at me. She was struggling with this just as much as I was, and yet, there was something in the air between us that felt inevitable. Clara, we can't, I whispered, my voice barely audible. This isn't. But before I could finish, she closed the distance between us. Her hand cupped my cheek gently, her thumb brushing lightly against my skin. Her touch was warm, comforting, and for a moment, all the reasons why this was wrong faded into the background. I know, she murmured, her face so close to mine that I could feel her breath on my lips. But I don't want to stop. My heart was racing, my thoughts tangled in a web of desire and guilt. I knew I should step back, should walk away, but the pull between us was too strong. I couldn't deny the chemistry, the connection that had been building for weeks, even if I wanted to. And then, before I could think, before I could stop myself, I leaned in. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant, as if we were both testing the waters, waiting for the other to pull away. But neither of us did. Instead, the kiss deepened, and the tension that had been simmering between us for so long finally broke free. Clara's hand slid up to the back of my neck, pulling me closer as our kiss grew more urgent. My own hands found her waist, and I could feel the warmth of her body pressing against mine. The world around us seemed to disappear, leaving only the two of us, lost in the intensity of the moment. It was wrong, and we both knew it. But in that instant, nothing else mattered. When we finally pulled apart, both of us breathless, the weight of what we had just done settled over us like a heavy fog. I could see the mix of emotions in her eyes, desire, guilt, confusion, all of it swirling together in a mess that neither of us knew how to untangle. I shouldn't have, I began, but she shook her head, cutting me off. Don't, she whispered, her voice raw with emotion. Don't say anything. We stood there for a long time, the silence between us thick with the weight of what had just happened. I wanted to say something, to try and make sense of the chaos in my mind, but no words came. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Clara stepped back, her hands falling to her sides. Her eyes were filled with regret, but there was also something else, something that told me this wasn't the end. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible. And then she turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me standing there, my heart still racing, my mind spinning with the reality of what we had just done. The air in the kitchen felt thick, almost suffocating after Clara left. My mind was racing, struggling to make sense of everything that had just happened. I stood there, frozen in place, my heart still hammering in my chest, my lips tingling from the kiss we had shared. It was surreal, impossible to believe that I had just kissed Clara, Anna's mother. It felt like I was trapped in a strange dream, one that I desperately wanted to wake up from, but couldn't. I should have felt nothing but guilt, but there was something else, something undeniable. The kiss had stirred something deep inside me, an attraction I hadn't fully acknowledged until now. It wasn't just the physical connection, it was the emotional intensity that had built up between us over the past few weeks. It was the quiet conversations, the shared glances, the subtle touches that had led us to this moment. But none of that changed the fact that it was wrong. We had crossed a line, one that couldn't be undone. I couldn't stand in the kitchen any longer. I needed air, needed to get out of the house, to clear my head. I quietly slipped out the back door, into the cool night air. The garden was quiet, the only sound the faint rustle of the wind through the trees. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart, but the weight of what had happened still pressed heavily on my chest. As I stood there in the dark, staring up at the stars, I replayed the evening in my mind, how innocent it had started, how quickly everything had spiraled out of control. What was I going to do? How could I face Anna, knowing what I had done? And how could I ever look Clara in the eye again after this? I stayed outside for a long time, lost in thought, trying to make sense of the tangled mess I found myself in. Eventually, I heard the faint sound of voices from inside the house, Anna's laugh, Robert's deep voice, the familiar sounds of a family that had welcomed me with open arms. And now I had betrayed them, all because I couldn't control whatever it was I felt for Clara. When I finally went back inside, the house was quiet. Everyone had gone to bed, and the living room lights had been turned off. I moved quietly through the house, not wanting to disturb anyone, my mind still reeling from the night's events. As I made my way toward the stairs, I saw Clara standing at the base of the staircase, her back turned to me. She was holding the banister, her posture tense, her head bowed slightly. For a moment, I thought about turning around, about slipping upstairs unnoticed, but something stopped me. I took a few tentative steps toward her, my heart pounding in my chest. She didn't move, didn't turn around, but I could sense that she knew I was there. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," Clara whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I never should have." "Clara," I said softly, but I didn't know how to finish the sentence. I didn't know what to say. She turned then, her eyes filled with tears. The sight of her like that, vulnerable and conflicted, made my chest tighten. There was so much pain in her expression, so much regret, but there was something else too, something that mirrored the turmoil inside me. "I don't know what's wrong with me," she continued, her voice trembling. "You're with Anna. I shouldn't feel this way." Her words echoed the confusion I felt in my own heart. I shouldn't feel this way either, but I did. I couldn't deny it any longer. As wrong as it was, there was a part of me that was drawn to Clara in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't just about attraction, it was deeper than that, more complicated. But no matter how real those feelings were, it didn't change the fact that they were forbidden. "I don't know what to say," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. This can't happen." Clara nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. "I know," she whispered. "It's just, I feel so trapped sometimes. Like I'm stuck in a life that doesn't feel like mine anymore." Her words hit me hard, and I realized that this wasn't just about me, or even about us. Clara was struggling with something much bigger, something that had been brewing long before I ever entered the picture. "Clara," I started, but she cut me off, shaking her head. "No," she said firmly, though her voice was still soft. "You don't owe me anything. I shouldn't have put you in this position. It's my fault." We stood there in the silence of the hallway, the weight of everything between us hanging heavy in the air. I didn't know what to do, didn't know how to fix this. All I knew was that we had both made a terrible mistake, and now we had to live with the consequences. "I think it's best if we don't spend time alone anymore," Clara said quietly, her voice full of sorrow. "For Anna's sake. For everyone's sake." I nodded, knowing she was right, but the thought of losing whatever connection we had built was painful, even though I knew it was the right thing to do. "I'm sorry," I whispered. She gave me a small, sad smile. "So am I." With that, she turned and walked up the stairs, leaving me standing alone in the darkened hallway, the silence pressing down on me like a heavy weight. The next few days were a blur. I avoided Clara as much as I could, and we barely exchanged more than a few polite words when we were forced to interact. Anna noticed that I was quieter than usual, but she didn't press me about it, assuming I was just tired or stressed from work. I felt guilty every time I looked at her, knowing that I was keeping this terrible secret from her. But what could I say? How could I ever explain what had happened? Time passed, and slowly, the tension between Clara and me began to fade, though it never disappeared completely. We had crossed a line that couldn't be undone, and no matter how hard we tried to pretend otherwise, the memory of that kiss lingered between us like a shadow. Eventually, life went back to normal, at least on the surface. But deep down, I knew that things would never be the same. There was a part of me that would always wonder what might have happened if things had been different, if we had met under other circumstances. But that was a fantasy, one that I couldn't afford to entertain. Clara and I kept our distance after that, and though the attraction never fully went away, we both knew that we could never act on it again. The cost was too high, and the risk too great. But the memory of that night, of the kiss we had shared, would stay with me forever. A reminder of the complicated, messy nature of human emotions and the thin line between desire and destruction.